Public Research with Daniel Schwartz. Episode 10. Ron Kampeas of the Jewish Telegraphic Agency on Israel-Palestine, October 7th, and the war in Gaza.
So, must have been a boring month for you. Nothing really to write about, huh?
Right. Yeah, it was pretty eventful, that's for sure.
I think just to start out, now we're a month into a war. I just want to start off just giving you opportunity just to sketch some thoughts about maybe what has surprised you most.
I think the start of the war surprised me most. The vulnerability that Israel allowed itself to get into after having sort of depicted the Gaza wall, or any of the walls that it's built. It's built 3 walls effectively, one around Gaza, one through the West Bank, and then one along the border with Egypt to prevent infiltration by migrants from Africa. And just that Israel is this massively well-protected country. It's got a nuclear capability. It's got a massive army, well-trained army, and yet they were hugely vulnerable to. And not only were they vulnerable, it's not as even as if their soldiers were vulnerable. They left their civilians vulnerable. And for all the criticism that Netanyahu has sustained over the years, he was Mr. Security. He was the guy who was protecting Israel. He campaigned relentlessly for the year and a half he was out of power recently by saying that the people who had replaced him were hapless, that they couldn't protect Israel like he could. He pointed to their deal with Hezbollah, or the deal with Lebanon and Hezbollah, to create a safe zone for mining gas in Lebanon as an example of that. He called that naive, even stupid, and said it bolstered Hezbollah. And meantime, as much as he was paying attention to the north, he wasn't paying attention to the south. And this has devastated Israel. It's devastating the Palestinians now, obviously. It's changed things forever. And that was the big surprise. And I think everybody, including Netanyahu, was surprised by how savage the attack was. It's almost as if Israel for years said that Hamas represented the worst of Palestinian political tendencies, that it was a terrorist organization, that it was eliminationist. But you could see in the actions of Netanyahu that it didn't kind of believe it, because on the other hand, Netanyahu is effectively sustaining Hamas by diminishing the Palestinian Authority, by diminishing Fatah, Hamas's natural rival, by allowing Qatar to funnel money into the Gaza Strip, which Israel didn't even bother to try and control or to monitor where it went. And so that all conveyed the impression that, and this was, I've read somewhere that this was Yahya Sinwar, the head of Hamas, wanted to convey this impression that Hamas was moderating, that it wanted nothing more than to eventually be recognized as the proper government in Gaza, that it was a pothole type government, that they were trying to fix things. So when this burst out, it embodied certain nightmares, I think, that the Israeli peoples have had about Hamas for years, but were maybe at a point where they were thinking maybe they weren't quite real, that maybe there was a modus vivendi they could have with Hamas.
Just a quick detour. Did you see the Haaretz article today about how Max Blumenthal, the son of Sidney Blumenthal, who runs this site called the Gray Zone, basically has been we've seen the rise of basically this atrocity denial about October 7th, that it's pretty vile stuff, that the Jews killed the Jews,
Right.
And I've just been wondering this, because we now have, to a degree that was not true 15 years ago, a lot of pretty prominent young anti-Zionist Jews who really despise Israel, like Max Blumenthal, for instance. Do you think there's any chance we're going to see some kind of modification of the right of return, where, not for Max Blumenthal, or or Norman
Right.
Finkelstein.
I see what you're saying. I think that that's gonna. I mean, the one major modification of the right of return came with the Brother Daniels case, which I think was in the 1960s, in which somebody who was assigned a priest or a monk or some sort of Roman Catholic figure who was assigned a post in Haifa at a church in Haifa wanted to emigrate under the law of return because he was born Jewish and he'd converted in his adult, and he argued that he was correct, that he was halakhically Jewish. He was Jewish according to religious law because you can never renounce your Judaism. And the Supreme Court ruled that if that may be true, but he effectively cut himself out of the Jewish people by embracing Christianity. That's a very tangible act, converting. Saying stupid things like Max does. It's where do you draw the line? Who do you start excluding from going to Israel under the law of return? I know that there are people who are not as offensive as Max, but I think who are like anti-Zionists who have made Aliyah. As weird and made Aliyah, like, not to become anti-Zionist after making Aliyah and after emigrating to Israel, but who went. There's somebody, I think, in the Women in Pink, I think it's called. I forget what the group's called. Who made Aliyah, and nobody stopped her. Nobody rejected her. So I think it would be such a. I don't think they wanted to. I don't think they want to start that war. There are too many wars over defining who is a Jew is already. I don't think it. I think it would be too hard for them to
Right. Yeah, I'm not advocating that, to be clear. I was just, it seemed like something that like Ben Giver, Smotrich might have an idea for in the future. But I was saying recently that anti-Semitism in America can often be opaque topic. But I said one metric for if things are really getting bad in America will be if Max Blumenthal makes Aliyah. that would be a tangible metric.
Where do things have happened?
Yeah. So about October 7th, the fact that there were so many battalions in the West Bank instead of the South on that day within Israel, has that caused any kind of re-examination about the settlement enterprise in the West Bank?
I haven't seen that yet, but I think that because the people who would criticize it, the people who would be most prone to criticize it, are the people who were
Right.
organizing the protests for a year against Netanyahu's planned judicial reform. They were getting close to saying that the settlement enterprise were not just getting close. They had, like, for instance, after the settlers had rampaged through the West Bank village of Hawara, they said that was part of the problem. They're certainly not happy having Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir in government. But I think that could come. It's likely to come. But right now, the same people who would make that connection in Israeli society are preoccupied with fighting Hamas.
Right.
So I don't see that happening. I don't see it happening near term, but I do see it happening. As once the war tapers down, and Netanyahu faces a political accounting, I think that his allies also face a political accounting, and that there will be questions about how much is devoted. Israelis, for a long time, they turned a blind eye to what the extremist settlers. It's not the entire settler movement, but what the extremist settlers were doing, like the settlers who had rampaged through Hawara. It's going to come out that that during this war, that the attacks on Palestinians by settlers in the West Bank intensified. It's going to come out that more Palestinians were killed in that period, and it's going. And I think what is one conclusion that sector of Israel is going to draw is that just at the moment that we were trying to contain this war to Gaza, that we didn't want it blowing up in other places, which would make it much less manageable. These people were creating that risk, and I think that's going to work against the settlement enterprise, I think.
Right. Now let's talk about the IDF campaign in Gaza. The casualty numbers. I'm not an expert. So it's the Hamas run Gaza Health Ministry. We know they've gotten stuff wrong. Like I think probably 3 weeks into war maybe they were still saying that Israel had only killed 4 members of Hamas, right? Or something
Right.
like that. And
Right.
also, they said I think they said 500 people died in the hospital bombing. That was really it was a missile on a parking lot, and it wasn't 500 people. But how do you regard the figures?
I mean, I think that I think the figures are probably correct. I think that the UN and the World Health Organization have validated them to a degree. I think that Israel has validated them to a degree. The reason but because of those um, anomalies, or not just anomalies, but because of those errors, unforced errors, when they attributed the hospital bombing to Israel, when the health ministry attributed the hospital bombing to Israel, and then exaggerated the figure, or maybe didn't, or overstated the figure by a factor of 5. That means you still have to be a little bit wary of how they're counting, and that's why it's important, I think, for our readers to know where the figures are coming. I don't think
And it could be lower. Like they could be their numbers could be lower.
Yeah, yeah, they might be underestimating us. We won't know until this war is over.
It's funny. It's like the two different sides are having totally different conversations. One side is saying Israel is trying to destroy Hamas, keep Israelis safe. And a lot of my friends on the left are saying this is genocide. This is a genocide. And they're not even sort of in the same conversation. How do you make sense of this?
And I'm not going to. We're not going to use words like genocide or ethnic cleansing, because there's no evidence that attaches itself to an understanding of either term right now. God forbid it could come to that. There have been talks on the far right of removing the population, or much of the population, of Gaza to Egypt voluntarily. Those situations, they're never quite voluntary. Even when they are voluntary, it still manifests as a form of ethnic cleansing. But that hasn't happened, and nobody serious has actually posited that. So until God forbid, those eventualities take place, I think it distorts the reporting. It distorts the standing of the reporting, and it doesn't really serve anybody well. It shuts down understanding rather than expands
Yeah.
it.
Let me rephrase my question. Do you think the IDF has been too aggressive, too brutal?
Yeah, I mean, I don't. It's like it's hard to, because I'm not there.
Right, right.
I'm not seeing what the extent of the damage is, and what I mean, I do know, for instance, that the Biden administration is unhappy with Israel for not being more targeted, for using a hammer instead of a scalpel, or however you want to call it, in terms of going to the Gaza Strip. I know that they've advised them of that. I know that there's an American perspective that while Israel has not, committing genocide, that it has not been as precise as it could be. I do know that also the Israel, whereas once it would have, every army makes a calculus as to whether protecting a civilian population is worth what risk is it worth to their soldiers. And I think that Israel 50 years ago would have been erred more on the side of the civilian population. I think in the last 20 years or so, it errs more on the side of protecting the life of its soldiers. Whether that amounts to negligence that meets the definition of war crimes, I'm not sure. There has been that trajectory, I think, but to what degree that merits, whether it is the sort of quiet imprecations of the Biden administration, or whether it is the kind of the all-out criticism of Israel, I don't know yet.
There's been 2 op-eds published by members of the Netanyahu government, the Minister of Intelligence and Danny Danon, who was the ambassador to the UN, and then another guy whose name I'm forgetting wrote a Wall Street Journal op-ed. And the gist of what both are saying is, after the war, it might be good if other countries took many of the Gazans. It's a little bit disturbing for me personally to see that. It makes me wonder if that's sort of the hope is, hey, we're going to destroy Hamas. That's the sincere objective, and we might end up like really damaging all of Gaza, and maybe in the end we can have a lot of the Gazans go to Sweden. I mean, do you have a sense of, is that sort of a hope for this government?
Is it the hope of this government? I don't know if it's the hope of this government. I think this government, when it, holistically, when it thinks of what happens after the war, is thinking of what costs the Israel the least, and there are never mind the moral considerations, which of course are substantial, but there are huge political risks for Israel, and even security risks for Israel in attempting to carry out an operation like that. So I don't believe, I could be wrong, I don't believe that Netanyahu or others in his in his orbit would even contemplate something like that. You're right, Danny Danon is a member of his Likud party, but he's kind of he's a person who's known for saying outrageous things. So it's not, and he's a backbencher right now. He was ambassador to the UN, but I wouldn't take what he says as the gospel of the party.
Or the agriculture minister saying Nakba 20.
Right.
You think
he said it in such a weird context, because they were asking him about the act of moving Gazans, Palestinians, from the north of the Gaza Strip to the south of the Gaza Strip, and that was it. And he called that, this is Nakba 2, but which is like, it's, the Nakba was not moving Palestinians a few miles in one direction or another. It was the outright removal of them, whether by forceful expulsion, but because they were urged to by their compatriots, by others. In any case, these people didn't just go a couple of miles away from their home. They went far away. So I don't know why he was using that phrase. I think he was doing it to sound like like a tough guy. It didn't make much sense in context.
Do you have any sense of what is the level of concern or awareness among Israelis about the sort of, for lack of a better term, PR damage that figures like a Ben Giver or a Smotrich, who described himself as a quote homophobic fascist, I believe.
He has described himself as that once, yeah.
I mean, this is like, these people are just the greatest gift to the people who hate Israel. Do you sense that the Israelis care about this perception damage?
Oh, I think they do. I mean, certainly, I'd say two things. I think they generally do in the long term. There was a lot of concern, like I said, before October the 7th, when Israelis were protesting against the government about the image that Smotrich, and not just Smotrich, so there's also or Ben Gvir, there's a diaspora minister who managed to insult the diaspora.
Emma Shickley,
yeah, and so that I covered that, and then I was surprised to see the degree to which that was, even my coverage was becoming an issue for him in Israel, and he had to defend himself on TV. But I covered it in terms of like how unhappy the American Jewish community was with him, but it refracted on him in Israel. So yes, I think they are very concerned about that kind of image. On the other hand, I'd say right now, in terms of what's going on in the war, they're not focused on what they're focused on when the international community thinks. They're focused on one particular member of the international community, that's President Joe Biden, and they're focused on the degree to which they can maneuver in the war, on the degree to which Biden will allow Israel to maneuver in the war. So they're not thinking so much about Israel's image right now. That's going to come back, though, I guess. I'm pretty sure after the war abates.
Right. I keep forgetting that when I ask my questions, because this is such a small country where everybody is touched by everything, that they are completely focused on the war, which is understandable. I think it's been about a decade since Netanyahu came to the United States and famously gave a speech in Congress
Right.
sort of thumbing his nose at Obama in 2012, I believe.
Right.
And it was seen as a
2015.
Oh,
2015.
was
Right.
it? It was 2015?
Yeah, it was in
Oh,
just as the
oh,
Obama administration was. There were other tense moments before then, but it was just as the Obama
oh, my
administration was
bad.
consolidating its Iran nuclear deal, and that's when
Ah,
he came to speak out against. Yeah.
okay, my mistake. Well, so not 10 years, but pretty close to 10 years. And a lot of people warned at the time, Israel was a bipartisan sort of issue in America. And people said, Netanyahu shouldn't get in bed with the GOP so publicly and insult the Democrats.
Right.
We just had this massive pro-Palestine march in DC recently. Was that the fruits of this gamble? Do you think the gamble has paid off, or has it backfired?
Oh no, it backfired. I think sorry, Netanyahu before October the 7th was sort of twisting himself into pretzels into trying to justify the damage that had happened. And there was recognition, I think, in Netanyahu's circle about how much. I don't think they anticipated how angry Democrats were that he was doing that. I don't think they understood the optics of a John Boehner, a white Speaker of the House, saying the day after the State of the Union address, now we're going to have somebody, effectively, I forget what he said, I'm paraphrasing, but he said, now we're going to have somebody serious talking about Iran, because Obama had talked about Iran in the State of the Union and how that looked to Black Democrats. The white guy, the smart white guy, is going to come and he's going to put our Black president in his place. That's how it played out. I don't think they'd anticipated how deeply that was felt. I don't. There were and there are still some Black Democrats who are very, very pro-Israel. One who was consistently and unrelentingly pro-Israel was a guy who since retired, Charlie Rangel from New York. They had to beg him to attend this speech by Netanyahu because they didn't want to have like a speech without a single blackface. And so that's like that's how much even Charlie Rangel felt the diss, so to speak. And so and so like I said, Netanyahu's been twisting himself into pretzels into advancing it. Now he says, most recently, I've heard the excuse that that it led to the Abraham Accords because the Gulf states, who were also wary of Iran, saw that Netanyahu could even stand up to Obama, and they were impressed. And it's like, no, that's just that's too attenuated, that excuse. And so it created, I think it created room for Democrats who are already wary of Netanyahu and his right-wing politics to openly write him off. And there was, I mean, I've covered this deeply. There are a lot of Jewish lawmakers. They're disproportionately more. I think now there are 34 in both chambers of Congress. There are, and they have a lot of Jewish staffers, and there are a lot of Jewish staffers who work for non-Jewish lawmakers, and they were like mortified because they see it as part of their remit to advance U.S. policy and the Israel-U.S. alliance. They don't see that as a contradiction because they think that the Israel-U.S. alliance is good for the U.S. And then here comes somebody who just made it much more difficult. And in fact, they began to, I think, rethink aspects of the U.S.-Israel alliance because they identified Israel with Netanyahu, and it led to what you described earlier, that there's a lot of disillusionment among younger Jews with Netanyahu. And it wasn't just that speech. That speech was the breaking of the dam that opened the flood, but there was also his embrace of Trump, who was reviled by a vast majority of American Jews. His eager embrace of Trump, and he still doesn't get it. He just gave today. He just gave Elon Musk a tour of a kibbutz, and Elon Musk has just recently been advancing like classic anti-Semitic white supremacist ideology. Not just allowing it to advance, not just sort of hinting at it, but expressly agreeing with it on Twitter, which he now owns. And so that kind of thing, that kind of deafness, I think, has been very bad for Netanyahu. It proved it to be a really bad bet for Netanyahu, and it proved that it was a bad bet for Israel as well. I mean, the co-prime ministers of the government that lasted for a year and a half, Naftali Bennett, who came from the right, and Yair Lapid, who came from the center left, and who worked together to try and build unity, the one thing that they worked more hardest on, I think, was rebuilding the relationship with the American liberals and also Netanyahu's president, Isaac Herzog, the guy who's president right now. He's also very dedicated to that proposition. They see it as enormous loss.
I was really eager to speak to you because you've obviously been paying attention to Israel, the United States, and these issues for a long time. When October 7th happened, my mind immediately went back to Munich. It was actually bizarre. I was watching the movie Golda, actually, the day before October 7th, and which is irony. But I thought about Munich, right? And especially when I was watching some people on the left, sort of the gross reaction, the famous tweet, what did you think decolonization looked like, writing essays, which was
Right.
famous. And then my mind was like, oh, is this new or has this always been this way? Because I remember the movie Munich, which obviously was based on real events, and I remembered the Baader Meinhof gang and
Right.
the contempt they had for Israelis even back in the 70s. So how much are we seeing something new in the discourse about Israel, and how much are we not?
Yeah, I think that this has always been in evidence on parts of the left. It's a kind of view of Israel that informed Soviet anti-Zionism, which was, which is why there were, like, before you had radical Islam as one of the competing ideologies in the Middle East, you had that kind of far left embrace of Soviet anti-Zionism, and that was very popular. And a lot of the critiques that you're getting now from the far left, they're familiar from that period. I think it had abated for a long time because of the collapse of the Soviet Union, or it's the fact, or it wasn't really noticed. It was thought that there was a period when, for Israelis, if you're looking at it from an Israeli perspective, you had this isolation from the rest of the world, or not the rest of the world, but a big chunk of the world, up until the collapse of the Soviet Union. And then with the collapse of the Soviet Union, which was simultaneously with the Oslo peace talks in the early 1990s, you had a rush of countries recognizing Israel and doing business with Israel, because there was no longer any incentive to cut off Israel, because the Russians, they weren't really the post-Soviet Russians were recognizing Israel, they were embracing Israel. So why would their satellites, to the degree that they remain satellites, not recognize Israel? And also, Israel had become an economic powerhouse. It made no sense to cut off a source of commerce and a source of know-how. And so that happened, and I think the Israelis thought that a lot of that was behind them, and particularly because of the Abraham Accords and in relations with 4 Arab countries that had previously been unimaginable. I think they ignored the degree to which, I'm not sure that it necessarily, these thoughts about this rejectionist, eliminationist ideas about Israel necessarily had disappeared, but they ignored the degree to which they were still nascent in certain parts of the intelligentsia on the far left, and how quick they were to return.
Do you know the Rabbi Eric Asherman by any chance?
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
Rabbis for Human Rights. Yeah.
Yeah. And he's a guy, and I heard him speak a few years ago, and it was really powerful. And this guy has been stabbed multiple times by these very extreme settlers who
Right.
basically, when they go to harass like a Palestinian olive farmer in the West Bank, he just like sort of stands there, and sometimes he'll like quote the Torah, this is wrong. And so it's very powerful work that he does, I think. And I see stuff like that, and young people see stuff like the behavior of these most extreme settlers going into people's houses saying, you have 24 hours to leave, with a gun on their back.
Right.
And the IDF doesn't seem to, we don't, or maybe they do, but I don't see them arresting these people. I don't see them cracking down. And then you hear about the Israeli minister who oversees the West Bank is like supportive. And it always seemed to me, if Israel is, after the war, if they really are worried about young people turning against Israel, hey, there's one easy gesture. Just start arresting these people, like make a show of that. Or is that just too much of an ask? I mean, is that possible?
Israel's greatest weakness, I think, has always been how to deal with the settler movement. They've managed to represent themselves in the Israeli imagination. It's at times, not always, as inheritors of the people who built the country before 1948. One of the greatest paradoxes I noticed, and I noticed this years ago about the settlers, is that they they treat the Israeli government, which is the manifestation of Zionism. This is like what we wanted was to govern ourselves, to have sovereignty, but they treat it as an occupier. They treat it like they're still like the British. They're still, the British mandate. They go and they build settlements in the middle of the night. Sometimes that they're dragged away, and there's just this inherent unhappiness, not unhappiness, there's just an inherent reluctance among the Israeli establishment to treat them like they would others who were doing these things. If Palestinians sort of snuck into Israel, built in Green Line and built a settlement in the middle of the night, it would last 5 seconds. But but they do this, and they claim they claim a biblical mandate, which is very culturally appealing to certain parts of the Israeli populace. They claim that they're the inheritors, like I said, of the pioneers. They take risks. They imagine them, they present themselves as heroic, and sometimes people buy that. And I think that's the reluctance. That's like I was in the Israeli army and years ago, and I was in a program for people who were drafted when they were already well into adulthood. I was 28. And so they don't have this anymore, but it was like a 4 months training, and then you go into the due reserves with everybody else. And so we were trained. The people who were training us were very talented young people who were much younger than us. They were 20 or 21. And I just remember getting open fire orders, and there was this standing order that, at least then, not to open fire on people, let's say, who were about to throw a stone, because it just didn't justify the lethal force. But if they were about to throw a Molotov cocktail, even if they were carrying a Molotov cocktail, you didn't open fire. But if they had it and they were about to throw it, then you could open fire. And then in the rare instance where you saw somebody with a gun, because this was about the Intifada, it wasn't yet about actual warfare, was a completely different thing. If you saw somebody with a gun and they were about to fire on somebody, then you could open fire to protect life. And I put up my hand and I said, and it was 1988, and I said, what if the person with the gun is a rogue settler, and what if the person he's aiming at is a Palestinian? Do we open fire on the settler? And the poor young guy, was just completely flustered. He didn't know what to say. And he said, that's just never going to happen. And of course,
Wow.
subsequently has multiple times. They didn't know how to deal with it. They didn't want to think about it. It's like that. I think that was typical in the sense that they just never wanted to imagine that situation where you would have to open fire on a fellow Jew who was about to, and the problem with that is that they let their guard down, and I don't think they realized the viciousness and the anger that fueled the far right in Israel, that fueled the people who backed the extremist settlers, and what culminated in the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin. They didn't, there was a known threat, and they didn't take it seriously, and I think that's part of it. They just didn't imagine that Jews would open fire on Jews, although it's happened multiple times, or or that there would be situations in which you would have to use force to protect Palestinians from Jews.
So the situation seems to me to be this: the majority of Palestinians don't believe there should be the existence of Israeli state, and the majority of Israelis don't believe there should be a Palestinian state now.
Right.
Is that the situation?
It varies. I think that when a two-state solution looks viable, when there's relative peace on both sides, and you have leaders who seem to willing to carry it out, it becomes much more popular on both sides. So I think it varies in that sense. The Palestinians and the Israelis both want peace, and they both want to go about with their lives, but they want it to happen in a way that's viable. And so, like, you have like people favoring a one-state solution, among the Palestinians, when the two-state solution just doesn't seem achievable. But when it does seem achievable, because you've got political will on those occasions, and it's been like 15 years since that happened the last time, it becomes more popular. But so I'm not sure that it's necessarily set in stone that the Palestinians don't want to. I don't think that they're like, I don't there are some of them who actually like the idea of like having a Jewish state next door in one way or the other, like a few in the intelligentsia. But generally, I don't think that necessarily the Palestinians, want a Jewish state next door, but they can be persuaded to live with one under certain circumstances, and vice versa.
Do you know Caroline Glick?
Yeah, I don't know her personally, but I know who.
So I'm obsessed with Israeli politics. So I don't speak Hebrew, but I follow it. And one of the ways I'm able to sort of keep tabs on what the Israeli right, or sort of far right maybe, is thinking is I watch her show on JNS. And I know she wrote a book, I think it was called maybe the One State Solution or something. Well, but there are these people on the Israeli far right who do believe in a one state solution,
Right,
a
right.
very different kind. But can you sort of explain what is the Smotrich vision for the West Bank?
I think that it does, in that, in their version of utopia, it does involve like Palestinians just leaving because they're no longer. They finally recognize that this isn't their land. They have some sort of delusion that could happen. Otherwise, that's the thing. Try and pin somebody down on how this functions. How does it work when Palestinians are, when you're having your one state? How does they, they'll talk about a certain type of limited representation on the municipal level. That's one thing they'll talk about. The ones who are more moderate, the ones who aren't Smotrich, the ones, like, for instance, who live in Gush Etzion, which is a block of settlements south of Jerusalem near Bethlehem, and they're known for being more moderate in their outlook. And these are, and these are, they're decent people. They actually try and assist the Palestinians, which is in a sense, it's ironic because they're actually in the, go out and they try and figure out the bureaucracy for the Palestinians and help the Palestinians through the bureaucracy and get things to the Palestinians. They know what that there are inequities, but they still kind of imagine a future where there wouldn't be. And so the problem is that government is holistic. Self-rule is it's a holistic thing. You can imagine maybe a world in which somebody sort of like runs their municipality and they have garbage pickup and everything's smooth, but they're doing well. But if you're not really, it's not like foreign trade, it's not like foreign policy, it's not like security policy are utterly divorced from that kind of governments. You do need, for sovereignty to work, you actually do need some kind of say in that. I mean, and so the classic example is that when Oslo happened, there was this whole thing, but while Israel was still sovereign and still like actually running the West Bank, that they would facilitate the export of Palestinian produce so that the Palestinians could have the same markets that Israel was used to, and vice versa. And it never happened because the Israeli agricultural industry was never going to give up its preeminence, because it meant it's like no capitalist enterprise is going to do that. You're making money, and for ideological reasons, you're going to ask to actually help a competitor. It doesn't work that way. You need to, if you're going to be a town that's adjacent to some farms and they want to sell their produce, at one point, if they have to run through an Israeli bureaucracy, not just a Palestinian bureaucracy, things are going to get screwed up, and people are still going to want to have national sovereignty. So they don't really have effective answers for that. They never get that deep into it. And I'd like to know what their answers are, absent giving the Palestinians a vote or getting two states, but I haven't heard any viable answers yet.
I remember hearing that the Smotrich figures like that want to annex part of the West Bank. Can you explain what part of the West Bank?
So basically, I think they want to annex all of it, Smotrich, etc. What Netanyahu wants to annex is Area C, because Area A is this is what I was talking about, ostensibly under full Palestinian control, but it's not. Israeli forces enter Area A whenever they want to. Area B is supposedly under civilian Palestinian control, under Israeli security control. Again, it's not an arrangement that really functions. And Area C is land that's supposed to be resolved at some future date. And so, and it's kind of a lot of farmland. It's less populated. Canada and sorry, Canada. How did I say Canada? It's less populated. Much of the Palestinian population is concentrated in areas A and B, but area C has a lot of arable farmland. It's also necessary for Palestinians in the area A and B cities to cross through area C to make it contiguous, etc. And that's what Netanyahu had hoped, not all of it, but he wanted to, as part of the peace plan that the Trump administration was advancing, and this is separate from the Abraham Accords, this is the actual Palestinian peace plan. He hoped to annex parts of it, and that actually brought him into tension with at least part of the Trump administration. One of its most important part, the Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law, who actually wanted to. It's interesting what happens when you actually start involving yourself in negotiating peace. You become invested in an equitable outcome, and so Kushner actually. Even though he didn't advocate for a two-state solution, he wanted to give the Palestinians as much as they could so that they could achieve some sort of sovereignty, and that's what brought him into conflict with Netanyahu. If you look Kushner's book, you'll see that.
And so in the annexation, what happens with the Palestinians? Do they become Israeli citizens?
So there are, like, in the areas of Area C that Netanyahu would want to fully annex, so this has been discussed, and it's been discussed for years. Like I said, some of the people who live in Gush Etzion, like where the relatively moderate settlers live, have talked about this. Yes, they would become Israeli citizens because there may be like, a total couple of 100,000 of them who actually live there. So that wouldn't affect the demographic balance in Israel.
Okay, so is this the idea? The idea is this: we're going to annex the parts that aren't become mostly Jewish. So it won't, and yeah, we'll give the Palestinians their two citizenship, but it won't really matter because the math won't really change that much. Is that basically the idea?
Yeah, that's one of the ideas.
Okay.
That's one of the ideas.
Okay.
For sure.
So I listened to, and I'm going to butcher this Israeli name, Anit Wolf.
Oh, Anat Wolf. Anat Wolf.
Yeah, I was listening to her on a podcast. And she was saying, Israelis are fine with the Palestinian state, basically, and we've been reaching out for peace over and over again. And the Palestinians can't accept a Jewish state. And I understand that argument. And those people definitely have a case. They said that there's been 9 offerings, and certainly Israel has offered, and certainly the Palestinians have walked away. Camp David 2000 in ways I think are totally tragic. But it seems to me this argument, it doesn't really, it's after like a decade of Netanyahu governance and that's their sort of policy in the West Bank with settlements. I don't know if that argument holds water anymore, because my question for her would be, well, is the settlement policy in the West Bank reaching out for peace? It seems like they've just given up on that. I mean, what do you think?
No, I think you're right. I think that's it's a good question, because I think that two different peoples with two different types of power, like obviously in a lot of sectors, the Israelis are much more powerful and have much greater agency than the Palestinians. So the sins against getting to a peaceful outcome are going to be different in both sides. And so, like you said, and like Anat Wolf has said, I think the Palestinians didn't see certain opportunities. I think, like, one of the most obvious instances is actually Annapolis in 2007, 2008, because their problem with it at the time was that Ehud Olmert was, it was facing indictment. I don't think he was under indictment yet. He was facing, and eventually he did go to jail for corruption. And they said, okay, you're asking us, like, why didn't we accept this offer? Well, the prime minister was a lame duck prime minister. But that's not, Israel isn't the United States. Once Ehud Olmert goes, his policies don't go. He was about to hand off, and he did hand off the leadership of the party to Tzipi Livni, who was every bit as committed to the same things he was. And had the Palestinians actually played ball, Tzipi Livni might have actually won the subsequent election. And so so they really, I think that part of the problem is that the Palestinian political leadership, there are certain acceptances that they would have to make of Jewish statehood, of Jewish sovereignty, a Jewish historical claim that are very, very difficult for them to make. It's very interesting that often it always comes back down to, do the Jews have actually any kind of stake in the Western Wall, which is weird because obviously the archaeology and the history bears out a Jewish history at the Western Wall and at the temple site. But then they go into paroxysms of denial and weird sort of explanations about why that's not true. So that's on the Palestinian side. On the Israeli side, you've had like a very generous I don't like calling it generous, but very expansive offers that would result in a Palestinian state. But it's weird because in the meantime, you also have what you described, this sort of this settlement that mitigates against a Palestinian state. Like the open question is like, I know exactly what the mentality is, but it's anomalous that if you're actually concerned about security in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and you think that and Netanyahu's, and there's a certain logic to this. If Israel gives up security control of the Jordan River, of the border with Jordan is not exactly the most stable country. They could be overrun by Al-Qaeda. You could have this sort of the same thing happening from the east as now is happening from the west with Gaza. These are all legitimate concerns. And so in that case, establish a very strong security protocol there. Say that you're not going to give up security control of that area until you're absolutely certain that you're going to be living in an absolutely peaceful Middle East, which might not be in our lifetimes. But don't settle the area. What does settlements have? What do placing civilians in those areas have to do with security? You're making them less secure. Why is that a security imperative? And so that it's a national imperative, and the national imperative mitigates against a Palestinian state and against a two-state outcome. And that's what's hard to and that's like you said, that is the Israeli sin against to come to a peaceful outcome.
I think we're a long way off from any kind of solution. It is very funny though, in America, among like young Democrats, the fashion now is it's all about, forget the two-state solution, it's all about one-state solution. Let's just say it happened tomorrow, okay? Everybody in Israel, Palestine is now one state. Have you thought about how that would play out?
I think there are people who certainly advance it. I think it's something that Rashida Tlaib, for instance, talks about. I mean, you see the issue with it now. How do you coexist with the mutual hatreds? And it could happen. But I don't see any. I mean, you need leadership for it to happen, and you need grassroots action for it to happen, which is what happened in Northern Ireland. And I'm not seeing either right now. The grassroots is as there have been efforts to encourage it to a degree. There have been some encounters, but it's much more difficult than it was in Ireland. You have I think it's an anti-normalization or among Palestinians, because they say Israel is so much more powerful that one shouldn't normalize that by engaging with Israelis. And so how do you get there are grassroots peace movements, but how do you expand them if that's like a prevailing outlook? And then you don't have exactly the same thing. As like I said, the Israelis and the Palestinians are different in the way they sin against peace, but you do have this attitude among a lot of Israelis. Why should we discuss it with the Palestinians? They're not going to listen to us anyway. So yeah, I mean, I just I don't know how you get there where you'd have the culture that would be necessary for peaceful coexistence to prevail. And that's why, I think that's why the people who advocate for two states realize how difficult that's become, but also just despair of anything else working. A one-state solution, however well-intentioned, could end up looking like October the 7th over and over again. And that's that's what it reminded Israelis of. It reminded them of they had historical memory, and there are people still alive, but they had historical memory of the massacres and the attacks that predated the establishment of the state of Israel.
Yeah, I'm still a two-state guy. Robert Wright, who I'm a huge fan of. He did an interview with Daniel Siderman, and it was like a ray of sunshine out of the darkness. I was like, yes, finally, can we make this guy the prime minister of Israel? Like, But
He's a yeah, he's a good guy. He's really like invested, and he's dedicated to what he does. Danny
the
Simon.
the most influential book right now in sort of the young left, I think, is Ilan Pappé's book on Palestine. He's sort of the hot author on the subject. Well, do you have any thoughts on Pappé?
I haven't like engaged with his ideas in years, so not really any deep thoughts about that, other than what I just said, that the people who like advocate, the intellectuals who advocate for a one-state outcome, I don't think are really in touch with the practicalities on the ground.
What do you make of the settler colonial accusation?
I think the people who embrace and advance that idea, they need to structure a historical narrative that doesn't align with actual history in order to do it. And that is that the European powers were absolutely instrumental. And certainly, like, obviously there were like the Balfour Declaration helped. The UN vote in November 29th of 1947 helped. But the people who brought it around were actual individual Jews who moved to Palestine, built settlements, built a self-governance, which was called the Yishuv before it became Israel, and then fought for it. I remember like talking to a guy, a colleague, Jack Katzenel, who was a late reporter for the Associated Press. He was a good guy. We were talking about like, Israel faced 6 armies in 1948. Why did the armies fold so easily? How come the Palestinians weren't as fierce as people thought they would be? And he said, I'd come to Israel in 1978. He'd come in like the mid-60s before the Six-Day War, and he was always a journalist. And he said, I've interviewed people who fought in the Independence War, and they really felt that they had no place to go. It was like, it's like what Golda told Joe Biden in his telling, in Biden's telling. They'd come out of the Holocaust Europe. They really didn't have any faith in the world actually setting up a viable place for Jews to be safe at that time. Remember, a lot of the thinking at the time was that the Nazis had not gone away completely, that they were coming back. And remember that some Jews who tried to return to their communities in Europe at the time were shunned, were even in a couple of cases massacred, and those stories spread very quickly. And so there were a lot of Jews who tried to get to the United States, which was difficult to get into, in Canada and Australia. They wanted to get as far away from Europe as possible. And there were a lot of Jews who said the best chance we have is Palestine, and that's why they fought. And so that is, on the one hand, one has to take into account, in terms of understanding 1948, the displacement of the Palestinians, what they call the Nakba, and how traumatic that was for them. But simply reducing that to some colonial exercise when there was no colonizing power, there were simply people who were moving to what they believed and what they had for centuries regarded as their historic homeland. It's just two different things. And it's not to say that an injustice wasn't done, and it doesn't have to be reckoned with in terms of what happened to the Palestinians, but it's ahistorical to call it colonization, and it's willful, and wherever it comes from, out of sympathy for the Palestinians and wanting to right a perceived wrong to the Palestinians, it dehumanizes Jews because what was an essentially Jewish action, one that was in line with, like I said, centuries, millennia of Jewish teaching and Jewish longing. It turns them into just an instrument of somebody else's power. Which is it's a bit of an anti-Semitic trope. There is a separate trope about Jews that you can't really blame them for being rapacious because they were forced to be rapacious. They were forced into usury by medieval Christian kings. I mean, and there's a grain of truth to that, but it's like it reduces Jews to simply being instruments of other capitalists, or of a hierarchical system, rather than understanding them as like a hugely complex and broad-based and deep culture. And it's dehumanizing. And I think that's the same thing for people who accuse Israel of being a colonizer.
I don't know if you've seen this, but these people on Twitter are now taking the footage of Israeli hostages waving, and they're being told by the Hamas people, keep waving in Arabic. And they're taking screenshots and saying, get yourself a woman that looks at you like this Israeli hostage looks at the
Yeah,
Hamas people.
it's gross. I mean, it's just it's gross. It's dehumanized. Like it's not taking into account that of course people who are scared are going to do um, are going to do what their captors want them to do because they're afraid for their lives.
I do believe it is possible for people to be anti-Zionist, really hate Israel, and not be anti-Semitic.
Right.
What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's possible. I mean, you know, I once had this discussion with Abe Foxman, who directed the Anti-Defamation League before Jonathan Greenblatt took it over until 2015. And he said, theoretically, there's a type of anti-Zionist who just hates any national expression, who doesn't believe in any sort of ethno-nationalism. But I don't know if that person exists because, he was saying that there are people, and he was right, there are people who embrace other forms of nationalism who would deny it to Israel. And that instance, that kind of like, it's at least a path to anti-Semitism if you're going to have that idea. But I think when he says that person doesn't exist, that's where I disagreed with him. Those people do exist. There are people who absolutely reject any kind of nationalism whatsoever. I remember being at a conference of some academic umbrella group, and they were debating whether to boycott Israel academically. This is about 10 years ago, and somebody said, why not? Why, if you're going to boycott Israel, why not boycott New Zealand? And somebody in the audience said, well, if the Maoris appealed to us to boycott New Zealand, I would do it in a minute because I don't believe in New Zealand either. So absolutely, there are people like that, and and they're not anti-Semitic. But I think that once there are anti-Zionists who embrace, and you see it, like you talked about it just now, people who embrace Hamas as a resistance, who glorify and elevate Palestinian nationalism. I mean, actual nationalism, not just the Palestinians, who are a culture or embracing the Palestinians. Obviously, there are people who are in need and who deserve our sympathy, but actually embrace Palestinian nationalism. And so all you're doing is really saying elevating one nationalism over another. And in that sense, if you're saying that if this works for you in every single case, nationalism works for you in every single case, except for Israel, then you might have a problem going there.
Can Israel survive without U.S. support?
Yeah, I think it could survive. It couldn't survive very happily, but it could survive for sure.
Do you have any thoughts on Norman Finkelstein?
Yeah, I don't know what happened to him. He's become like very sort of acerbic, and he seems to revel in just attacking and saying the opposite of whatever somebody he disagrees with says. If you look at him in the 1980s, if you look at his debates online with people, like there's one where he's debating Wolf Blitzer actually in 1989. He's kind of reasonable. He's like an interesting guy, but I think he became very embittered. I don't know. I mean, I shouldn't speak for him. I shouldn't project but he has certainly become less rational of late.
His debate with Alan Dershowitz is one of the classics. Have you ever seen that one?
No, I should look it up.
It's on YouTube. It's from like 2004. It's like, excuse me, Mr. Dershowitz, I read your book 2 times. Yeah, it's really great. So, anti-Semitism in the U.S. One of the things I ask all my guests is, okay, so let's just go anti-Semitism in America from 0 to 100. And let's say in 2004, it was a 27. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
What's the number today?
More like in the 40s, I'd guess. I think.
So that's what most people have said, like a doubling. Yeah.
Right.
What do you think of this demon person named Nick Fuentes?
Oh, he's an anti-Semite. He's a professional anti-Semite. I don't know if he believes what he says, but he's definitely an anti-Semite. It's a full-time job for him. In terms of his Holocaust denial, in terms of his blaming Jews for being overweening controllers of everything that happens. It's bad. He's an anti-Semite.
But you've seen many anti-Semites. I've seen many anti-Semites. There's something about him that's always struck me about is especially evil. I think it's the grinning, The sort of
Yeah, yeah. No,
smile.
like I said, he's a troll, and he revels in it. So yeah, for sure.
How worried are you about the Gen Z right?
I don't know yet. It's hard to say. I mean, I covered the trial of Robert Bowers in Pittsburgh, the man who killed 11 people in a synagogue in 2018. And he's not Gen Z, he's 48. But his commitment to anti-Semitism, his commitment to violence against Jews was extraordinary. And you see it online. And I don't, one can never say like to what degree that it's penetrated, but you see it online, you see it among young people. And after seeing that, what were really sort of vile ideas translated to like the worst action ever taken against Jews in history, and seeing that those ideas, you saw it in Charlottesville was Gen Zers, so a lot of them were not all Gen Zers, but there were a lot of Gen Zers in Charlottesville. And so when you see that, I can't say right now. Gen Z is too young; it hasn't developed enough yet. But there's certainly the possibility for some Gen Zers and generating a resurgence of anti-Semitism.
Who could replace Netanyahu? My concern is none of the alternatives. I don't think their English is good enough. Do you think it's Gantz?
Gantz, it's interesting because I knew Gantz glancingly when he was the military attaché here back in the 2000s, and he didn't impress me as somebody who was like a great orator. But his Hebrew speaking, it's like it's soaring. It's I just like I'm able to listen to it like when I've got like the radio on in the background and I hear him speaking. I haven't watched him yet, but I'd like to see Bibi's face because Gantz is really really good in Hebrew, and he would win hands down. I think one of the things that would be interesting is that although polls show Gantz winning and besting, and even like somebody like Naftali Bennett, who everybody wrote off because he no longer was attached to a political party after he left the prime ministership. People are talking. He volunteered. He put on his khakis and headed straight to the front on October the 7th, and that's the kind of sort of showing up that counts for a huge amount in Israel. So that's another person I wouldn't count out either.
You can find Ron Kampeas' reporting on all aspects of Jewish affairs at jta.org.